juggernaut and enablers of blue economy. Karibuni, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Minister Chuma, Monica, if I may, since we're in a conversation here, and Minister Wilkinson, Jonathan. So we're going to have a little talk here before the President arrives about what this conference has meant to us. And I'm sure it'll cause you to reflect yourselves on what the conference has meant for you. Let me just say personally that I had hoped for this conference that the principle of sustainable blue economy, emphasis on that first word, would be cemented in place, and I believe it has. And I'm eternally grateful, because that means that the blue economy will be there for our grandchildren to enjoy. That we have started off talking about the blue economy with that S word in front of it. So that's really important for me. Second one is that I travel around the world a lot. I'm in a different country every week talking to ocean groups. And Africa, let's be honest, has been missing from the global conversation when it comes to oceans. From this conference onwards, I know that Africa is central to the global conversation on ocean action. So that has, again, given me huge pleasure and satisfaction from attending this conference here in Nairobi. But I'll flip it across to Monica and Jonathan. I don't know who, perhaps Monica would answer first. What it's meant for you?
Thank you, Peter. I think this conference has meant a number of things. The most significant one is that we are in this together. That the scale of threat, of risks is upon us. Similarly, that we have a huge range of opportunities that all of us can harness. And I recall the statement of Museveni saying, why should we call this blue? We should call it life. It's all about all of life. Secondly, it's about balancing the ecosystem. That if we do not take urgent measures to begin to recalibrate the ecosystem, we could spell doom for humanity. So it's about recalibrating the ecosystem. It's about all humanity, and that is why we are delighted that we could convene all stakeholders. We've been having leaders, women, youth, business, and for each one of these, researchers, scientists, we have seen opportunities, we have seen a role for each one of us to play. So Peter, the main thing, we are in this together. It's a global enterprise.
I agree very much with Minister Juma. I think there's probably at least three things for which I would say that this conference has been very significant. The first is, I think the blue economy frame that's been talked about here actually allows us to integrate conversations that have been happening almost in silos. So issues around sustainable fisheries management, issues around illegal, unregulated fishing, issues around plastics pollutions in the ocean, issues around climate change, and issues around economic opportunity and prosperity often happen in separate lanes. And I think that the conversations that have happened here have been about how do we actually think about this in a much more holistic way. I think the second thing is broadening the conversation. Canada was fortunate to be the president of the G7 this year, and we talked a lot about some of these issues within the G7. But the G7 is clearly not a sufficient body to have this conversation. It needs to be catalyzed outside. It needs to be a global conversation. And through the work that Kenya has done here in this conference, we have most of the nations in Africa. We have many of the small island developing nations. We have many of the Caribbean nations. We have a whole range of folks who need to be part of the conversation, as well as civil society organizations. And so I think broadening the conversation is also really important. And the third thing I would say is, this isn't just a talking shop. The focus has been very much on how do we actually move to action. These issues that we're confronting are critical. They're important. They need near-term action. And all the way along, including the conversations that we had with President Kenyatta yesterday, the question has been, how do we move to action? And I think this conference, it's been about how do we move to action, which is a very positive thing.
From this conference in Nairobi, international attention will roll on next week, and many of us will be there, to Katowice in Poland, where the UNFCCC climate change meeting, COP24, will be taking place. At that meeting, my country, Fiji, the current president of COP23, will hand over to Poland. During the Fijian presidency this year, we have pushed to integrate the ocean and climate conversation, to make everybody realize that you can't talk about climate change without talking about ocean change. Here in Nairobi, there's been another kind of connectivity that has occurred, and that is the connectivity between the ocean, the regional seas, the lakes, and the rivers. Both Canada and Kenya, of course, have very significant lakes in their territories. We in the ocean community have been reaching out to the freshwater community and wondering how we can do that better, because the source to sea concept is the answer to much of the ocean's problems, especially in relation to coastal ecosystems, when you think about the pollution that comes down rivers. So, Monica, if I could first of all say to you, in Kenya's case, what does that mean for Kenya and really for the continent as a whole, that connectivity between land activities and the ocean's health?
Thank you, Peter, for that question. I think fundamentally it means that we have to think in a holistic and comprehensive manner. We have been told that what happens on land affects the oceans and vice versa, and that it doesn't matter how well we deal with the oceans if we don't deal with the land. It doesn't matter how well we deal with the fresh waters if we don't deal with the seas. So the whole notion about an integrated, sustainable planning for this is crucial. Secondly, it also means that a small country like Kenya can convene. I think that is one of the biggest lessons. Convene not just Africa, convene not just the South, but convene globally. I think this is the meaning of this meeting. And out of Nairobi, we sense a huge global consensus that has been building around the blue assets in their totality. I think this is the meaning for us. And this is important because when we have seen even a global issue that has been driven from one part of the world, it has been very difficult to sustain in a meaningful way. So we hope Nairobi begins to build the block for a global consensus for action to save humanity in the future.
I mean, certainly there's huge connectivity between many of these issues, and you talked a little bit about the connectivity between climate change and oceans, which obviously is incredibly tight. You see ecosystem change in the oceans driven by climate change probably more quickly than you see terrestrial climate change impacts. We certainly are seeing that in Canada with just the movement of different fisheries species, and you know, seeing, for example, killer whales show up in the Arctic that never would have happened before. So it is a harbinger, and it helps us to actually, I think, make clearer for people that climate change is happening now. This is not a 30 years in the future. It is happening now, and the implications are going to become more and more clear and more severe if we don't actually address the issue. With respect to lakes and rivers, you know, again, there is a lot of connectivity between the issues that we're addressing in the oceans and those associated with rivers and lakes. And I think, for example, about issues around ocean plastics. I mean, the vast majority of plastics in the ocean started off either in rivers or on a terrestrial level and end up in the oceans and causes the problems that we have. Certainly, for us in Canada, there's a huge link on the fisheries management side because many of the species of fish, especially fish, iconic fish like salmon, run up the rivers, live in the rivers, run back out into the ocean. And so the management of fisheries in the oceans and the management of fisheries on the rivers has a direct impact in terms of the health of our overall fishery. So they're definitely connected. We need to be having those conversations.
You've touched on plastics there. Let's talk about that a little bit more because I think that's probably been the banner on which we've all marched around the world in this great ocean action campaign that's going on around the world. I think the publics and the governments have reacted more to that plastic pollution problem the ocean has than probably anything else. It's probably because it's such a visual thing, and the public can actually understand it, and they can understand that it comes from their actions. I think the consensus would be that there is no silver bullet when it comes to solving this problem, but it is one that we have to solve. It's particularly rewarding to be here in Kenya, in a country that has banned single-use plastic bags, and that's increasingly been done, and other measures like that around the world. But would you like to just say a little bit more about what you think about getting over this problem? I know there is no silver bullet when it comes to plastic pollution, but what are your views on how we should get over it?
Well, plastics are a risk to human and animal life, to fish, and they have a way of coming back to us in terms of impacting on our health. I think the way to deal with this, the action to take, are what might seem like simple actions, but that have profound impact. The banning of the single-use plastic bags in Kenya over a year and a bit has had profound impact on our environment, on our animal lives. It was not unusual to slaughter an animal in the butchery and find plastics in their stomachs. You know, it was not unusual, or even they die out of that. So, and yet that one single act has had such a profound impact on environmental cleanliness. So I think it is simple actions, very bold in the beginning. We had numerous cases against the government. We stood it out. But the sum total is that even the populations begin to appreciate the value of those government actions. So I think leadership is important, government leadership is important, and sooner or later, the population comes behind you. So it is a campaign that must include everybody, government and the people, so that we can all work on this together. There is no small measure. Every measure that is positive has a domino effect that is valuable to the environment and to the blue economy.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of plastics is one that's actually important from a fisheries and a marine life management perspective. There is so many marine mammals and fish that are killed by ocean plastics, often ghost gear being the biggest problem there. But it's also that plastics break down over time into microplastics and end up in the food chain, which will have long-term implications for humans as well as for the rest of marine life. I think that there are lots of solutions out there with respect to plastics. There's certainly additional things that we probably need from a technology perspective, but it's about political will, and it's about doing things like what Kenya did when it banned plastic bags. It's about countries walking the walk, you know, in terms of doing things domestically, if they're going to speak on these issues internationally. And Canada recognizes and has led part of the conversation in the G7 around plastics, but we recognize that we have to actually put in place measures to address this domestically. So we are in the process of putting together a domestic strategy to reduce the amount of plastics that we use, to recycle much more of the plastics that we use. There are many things that can be done there, including working with people who produce the plastics to make them in ways that make them easier to recycle, to use less of them in the context of packaging of the products that they do. And there's probably technology issues that we need to look for that enable us to find ways to address plastics without necessarily building the full-blown infrastructure that is very expensive to do. But so there's a range of different things we can do. Sometimes it's also, you know, our own problem in terms of regulatory barriers. On the Ghost Gear initiative, which is a huge problem in oceans, you know, we sometimes put into place regulatory barriers that make it harder for ourselves. In Canada, we've found as we've looked at these issues domestically that we have a regulation, for example, that if a fishing boat picks up too many nets and they have too many nets on board and they're stopped by my department, they can be fined, even if what they're doing is picking up nets that are discarded. So there's a range of issues that I think we need to look at holistically, each of us domestically, and we can learn from each other about how we can best put together a strategy that addresses these issues.
Thanks very much for that. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to do two quick subjects, and I'm going to throw one to Jonathan and one to Monica. The first one to Jonathan relates to illegal fishing. $23 billion worth of illegal fish lands on our plates around the world every year. All of us have been receivers of stolen goods when we buy fish and chips in London or wherever it is that we eat our fish. We don't want to be criminals, but we have to fix that. And SDG 14.4 calls on us to fix that. So can I throw it to you, Jonathan? What can we do to stop illegal fishing?
Yes, you're exactly right. None of us wants to be contributing to a criminal enterprise. And I think that one thing to say about illegal fishing is it undermines the basis of sustainable fisheries management. And it's particularly unfair to countries that have limited capacity in terms of enforcement. So, you know, it's countries that see boats out there that they can't really do anything about that are effectively stealing their resources. And so it is an issue that we need to address for a whole range of reasons. We are at a point, though, that we probably can do that in ways that are going to be both more effective and more cost-effective going forward than what we would have been able to do 20 years ago. The technology to allow us to actually understand what's happening and where it's happening in the oceans is quite incredible these days. And organizations like Global Fishing Watch are helping us to better understand and to identify where we need to go and what we need to do. I think the ratification of the port state measures, which is something that I know you are particularly interested in, will help us to close off avenues for people to actually engage in illegal, unregulated fishing and to do that in a profitable way. And so there are a number of different things that we can do. I would certainly encourage those who are representing governments in the room who have not yet signed on to the port state measures that you consider doing so, and you consider doing so very soon.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. And what I'm going to throw to Monica, let me paraphrase first by saying that we live in a world in which multilateralism is the only answer. We live on one planet with one atmosphere, with one ocean, and we have a plan to safeguard that, which is the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. We have to implement that with integrity. How can we learn to trust each other more and make the implementation of that plan one that we do with integrity within the time zones? We've all seen the bad news. How do we turn that into good news? And I want to throw that to you, Monica, with one word, which is partnerships. What do you see about partnerships?
I think we have to continue talking. This convening here has evolved multiple conversations and friendships and information that can be shared across countries, across various stakeholders. We have to keep talking. Now, our partnership with Japan and Canada has proven, and other countries, several other countries that have co-hosted this meeting with us, has proven that from a conversation, we can begin to build consensus around a matter of mutual concern. So we have to continue talking, Peter. We will also continue talking in order that we can draw lessons from each other. From this meeting, a number of delegations have already committed to the next point of action in terms of drawing lessons on how to do a number of things, how to implement a number of frameworks, how to do the right legislative framework, governance framework, what lessons to bring, what technologies to begin to explore. So we have to continue to interact more. Our researchers have to speak with each other more often so that they can exchange knowledge. We have to drive this from a knowledge perspective. So it is partnerships, partnerships, and partnerships across people, across industry, across civil society, across government, so that we can continue to improve the framework of working together. Because as you say, no single country, no single stakeholder can do blue economy well and perfectly.
Thanks very much for that, Monica. We've been informed that our time is up, but I hope you've enjoyed that as much as I have. There are great challenges out there. Nelson Mandela was the one who told us that everything is impossible until it's done. So ladies and gentlemen, let's just do it. Thank you.